All right, this video is to show you how to find data in the World Bank website. You're gonna start by going to data.worldbank.org, and this site is going to give you the most of the data you'll need for the country report project. Also, if you're looking up data for any other countries, at any other time, this would be a useful site. So I'm going to do this example for Uganda. So you start typing in the name of your country, and then you should have be able to pick from the drop-down list. Um, it gives you some data already here, right, on this list. So some of this is useful. For example, the poverty headcount ratio is useful. Life expectancy at birth is useful, and you can even scroll on them, and it'll show you how it's changing over time. For example, now usually this gives you a shorter range than is actually available, so you don't want to just grab these. This only goes back to 2000, but in many cases they have data going much further. Um, and it also gives you some things like GDP. GDP as an aggregate isn't really useful because it depends on how big the country is. But GDP per capita is useful, and then you can have some choices. Okay, but this is not the preferred way. The preferred way is not just to grab whatever you happen to see here. The preferred way to look for data is to type in next to this bar. So I'm going to start with doing the data related to. I'm not going to grab all of it, but I'll just show you a couple of things. The data related to the first country report, and then I'll go into some from other future ones. So we can start by typing GDP per capita, and then we'll get some choices to drop down. So for this one, there's going to be two that we want. One is we want PPP, and the other one is that we want with exchange rates, which is just going to be in US dollars. Now, because we want to compare over time, if we're just comparing countries right now, we could use the current US dollar one. If we wanted to know, like, what's the GDP of Uganda, and we're going to look at it, what's the GDP of another country, and then see how per capita, and then see how they compare, that would be totally fine to use the current one because it's going to be valued in current US dollars. So every year is valued in the dollars and of that year, right? But since we're comparing over time, we actually want to use the constant ones. The constant ones then are normed at a specific price level, and so they can be compared over periods of time. Whereas if you use the current ones, you end up getting inflation in there as well. Okay, so here we go. We definitely want to use this one. GDP per capita, PPP, constant 2007 international dollars. So this is normed. And we see our chart. Okay, so the most current number is 2280. It goes all the way back to 1990 was 902, and because this is in constant dollars, these are directly comparable. So the GDP per capita is more than double that what it was in 1990. Okay, so in the 30 years, there's been some kind of growth. So it's more than double what it was, but it's still relatively low. All right, so I'm going to so we have this chart. You could just pick a couple points off the chart, like grab 2280, grab another point, and so on. You can also download the data over here, like in Excel form, for example, and then you could pick some of the points. But more of the probably preferred way to do would be to embed this. So embedding is that it'll actually display the chart, and people will be able to click on it in Canvas. Okay. So to do that, you go to share, and then it's going to look exactly like this, and then you just copy it. Okay. And then you're going to take it to Canvas, and I'll actually show you how to do that right now. So then we go to Canvas. So I'll pause just a second so I can open up a Canvas window. So now I can open up a Canvas window. I have this here, and I can choose Insert. I believe it's going to be Insert. And I go down to Embed. Okay. And so I paste my embed code here, and I submit. And now it's actually puts the chart, includes the label, and it already says it's from the World Bank. So you don't have to do any kind of citation of that because everything's already labeled. And then if I wanted to describe it, I could write about it here, right? I'm just showing you, I'm not writing about it, but anyways, and then I could continue on. So I can actually insert these directly into my country report for this week, and the people will be able to to scroll over them and see the exact values, which is very useful. So again, that's called embed, and we do it by insert, embed, then pasting in the embed code. And I don't want to save this, so I will just cancel it. Okay, so going back to the site, and then I can do the same thing. So that was for PPP. So that is the one that is adjusted for different purchasing power in different countries, and it's also adjusted so over time it's comparable over time because we're using the constant dollars. And then I can do GDP per capita. I'll just show you. I'm not going to do all of these. If I use the constant dollars but no PPP, this is without adjusting for price differences. So you can see the GDP in Uganda is much lower. You can also see the data goes back a little further. So they didn't have the PPP data until 1990, but they had other types of data before that, exchange rate data. And we can see the value is much lower. So it's less than half of what the PPP number is. That just tells you that the price level in Uganda is quite a bit lower than the comparison of, like, for example, the US. And then I also had the other one for income that you might want to do, and I'm doing Uganda because nobody is doing Uganda, is the GNI Atlas method. And we can use we can use constant, but we can also use current if we want to compare it to that World Bank standard. This one is mainly about whether or not a country is considered to be a low, middle, or high income country. Sorry, I did the wrong one. It shouldn't be that. It should be per capita. Yes, this is the one. And so this one seems like there was probably some big change in the way it was calculated. I'm not sure why. Oh no, it has to do with the value of money. So this is, again, if you use current, it's not good for looking at the past. It's not good for looking over time, because if there's like a major change in exchange rates or something else, it has a huge effect. Or if there's lots of inflation, it will have a huge effect on this, even though it didn't really change purchasing power very much. But this number, the most current one, the only thing you need it for on the report is just to classify as a middle, low, or high income country. And generally, this will be very close to the non-PPP number. Okay. You can also look at just out of curiosity, I want to look at the constant one, but I don't know what it's going to look like. So for that GNI, you don't necessarily have to give the whole series. You're really just using that one. You're really just using that one to decide if it's low, middle, or high income country based on the cutoffs given. But you're not doing anything else with that. So if I use the constant one, so it's basically, it ends up being basically the same, but you see it's a smoother series when you're using the constant. So on that one, I would suggest also using the constant one. That way, if you decide to use some of the other data points, it becomes comparable over time. So anyways, that's the key thing there. Now with poverty, on this front, we have the poverty headcount. So we want to use the poverty rates that are not at the national poverty line. The national poverty line can be misleading because it will show you the line is different in every country. So you're comparing apples to oranges to pineapples, right? They're not, every country has a different national poverty line, and often they're wildly different. So it is not comparable in any way. The poverty lines we're going to use is the poverty headcount ratios, and we have 3 of them. They used to be called like the $1, $2, and $3 a day lines. Now they've been adjusted up. So they're basically like $1, what $1 was worth back in, I don't remember the exact year that they refer to, maybe 1985. But basically in 2017 dollars, that's equivalent to $2.15. Okay, so sometimes they're still called the dollar a day poverty line, but that's basically referring to a period in the past, what $1 was worth at that time. So the 3 you want to use is the headcount ratio for the 215, 365, and 685. And the headcount ratio, not the gap. This will also show you data. I'm just going to look at one of them. Some of them may be not very relevant for your country. for example, there might be a few countries where the 215 number is close to zero and has been close to zero for the entire time period. In that case, you could choose not to show the data, but just to explain that it's extremely close to zero because yours is a high middle income country and there's very few people at the extreme poverty. Okay, so notice this one does not have a line drawn through it. Okay, so for this one, I probably don't want to embed because I could embed, but it's not going to look very impressive without a line through it. People have to probably look closely, especially if the chart is pretty small. The other choice is to just get some data points that make sense. So the end of this period is 2019. I think in the thing, I went back 10 years to 2009, and then I went back to like 1999, and then I went back to the beginning, 1989. I think that's what I did. And then you can just show, so you just make a little chart and include the 3 data points. You could just, simply copy them down into a chart, or you could download the Excel. If it's just a few, it's probably easier just to copy them into the chart. And then you could do the same thing with the same years for the other 2 poverty head counts, the 685 and the 3. Okay, so again, I would say embedding is good if it's a nice smooth chart with lots of data, and not embedding is probably better in other cases. Okay, so those are like the basic things you want to find for the first thing. You could also find the national poverty line. I'm going to do that real quick, but it's not as informative. So you can include it for kind of comparison purposes, but it doesn't tend to be very informative compared to the international one because it's just not comparable to other countries. And much of what we're trying to do right now is compare. So you can see poverty at the national poverty line in Uganda is much lower. And that's because since Uganda is a very low income country, the poverty line is set at a lower value than it is in probably most other countries. So what is considered to be like somebody who is quite poor is going to be, it's not set at the same as these international poverty lines. And so it makes it kind of artificially low. And then you might come to another country which is much, much richer, and it also has 20% of people living in poverty. And so if you were then to conclude that Uganda and that country, I just pick like a random country, maybe Mexico, Uganda and Mexico, and I don't know if Mexico's number would be 20%, but let's suppose it was. You then could, if you use the national poverty line for the 2 countries, and they had around the same percentage, and then you concluded that they had the same level of poverty, you would be totally wrong, right? Because the standard of living in Mexico is far, far, far above the standard of living in Uganda. And so you're not comparing people in the same situation, right? What is considered maybe lower end of middle class in Uganda might be considered relatively poor in Mexico, for example. So again, that's why we use those international lines that are set at specific values. Okay. Some other things that will be for the future. So if you want, you could just stop the video here and you can come back to it in the future weeks. But I'm going to keep going since I'm already here. Is if we want to look at inequality. So there's something called the Gini index. If you don't know about it now, that's fine. You'll learn a little bit about it in future weeks. And again, so we have for Uganda the Gini index values for various years, and the higher means more inequality, lower means less. And we find Uganda is kind of bouncing around. There's one year where it was sort of randomly lower, but then it's higher, and then it's a little low. But it's basically like not doing much. So you might just get a couple data points here if you wanted to include Gini index in the later report about inequality, not this week. Another thing you'll need again for a future week is the income shares. So I need the income share of various groups of the population. So this would be like, for example, what percentage of the income is held by the highest 20% group? And so in Uganda, that's about 50%, 49.5. Okay. And we see it's changed slightly, but again, if we want to get a few data points, we can grab the data points from here, or we can download the data. And this will be, you'll use this in a few weeks when you talk about inequality. And then if you put in that same thing, you can see income share I have income share by various different groups, right? Lowest 20%, that's the people, the 20% with the lowest incomes. And I have the second 20%, the third 20%, and so on. Okay. All right. Finally, and this will be much later in the class, you'll be looking for other kinds of data. And so it's all here. So like, for example, if I want to know what's the life expectancy in a country, and life expectancy at birth, total years, and male and female will be different. I'm just going to do the whole country here. And so I see the life expectancy for Uganda, and I can see it's about 63. It reached a peak of, what is that? I can't get the number to load. Looks like about 64, and then it fell. Okay, it fell in recent. So, anyways, but it was at a low of 43 in the early 1980s. There was a civil war going on, and it still was, and also the late 80s and into the early 90s. HIV was killing lots and lots of people, and there was no good treatments for it at that time. And so it had been a high of close to 50. But in the 1970s and 1980s, Uganda was quite unstable. Several different wars and conflicts. And then we had the HIV epidemic. And then in the early 2000s, the life expectancy started to rise quickly. Some of this was improvement in children's health. Some of this was also improvement in HIV treatment and other types of outcomes. Okay, so anyways, I can go to, for example, if I want to, if I don't want to go up to the thing, I can look at, for example, mortality rate for infants. Again, this is something, I'm just showing you data now, but we can see it went way down. So huge progress down to from 132 in 1960 per 1,000 births. The infants, they died. I believe this is considered in the first year of life. So 13% basically. Down to 31. 31 is still relatively high, but it is way, way lower than it was. And it's way lower than it was, again, like in the early 80s, and since then has been falling quite quickly. So anyways, so that would give you a hint that some of the change in life expectancy was coming from healthier outcomes for children. One more, I'll show you one more data point. Again, some of this is going in the future. I just want to show you that basically you just type whatever you need to find. If you know the keywords, you start typing it into the bar and leave the name of the country you want there, and then you wait till something happens. Fertility rate, this is the average number of children per woman. So it was pretty constant around 7 for all this time period. And then since the late 90s, it has started falling, and it's falling quickly. And now it's still high by international standards, 4.6. But again, when I was in Uganda in the Peace Corps, was 2003 to 2005. It feels like just yesterday, but it was pretty long ago. And it has fallen a lot since then in a relatively short period of time. Okay. So again, you can see, and it seems to have a downward trend. And so this is something we will talk about in a later part of the class when we talk about demographics, but you'll be able to find the data. Now for this one and the life expectancy data, definitely use that embed trick because it'll just look so much better. People will be able to see the whole thing. It's way more impressive to see the whole chart visually and see the change taking place visually rather than just looking at a few isolated data points. So anyways, so that is basically it. The only other thing I want to show you is I can remove Uganda. Once I remove Uganda, this becomes for the whole world. So if I remove the name of the country, keep the data point. So the whole world went from a high of around 5 to 2.3. And you'll find out 2.1 is kind of like a magic number. And we can also do regions. So for example, if I type in Africa, I could choose sub-Saharan Africa and see how Uganda compares to those if I wanted to, right? So it was around 7, close to 7 for the whole average for the continent, and now it's down to 4.6. So Uganda went from being quite high to being pretty average for the continent. So anyways, so this trend of dropping fertility must be basically happening around most of the continent for this number to be going down, on the whole average. So you can also put in names of regions there if you want to do. And it's if you're interested in data, it's pretty fun just to explore through. There's all kinds of other data here. I'm just focusing on the key ones we're going to do in this class. So, anyways, I know this video was probably too long, but so sorry about that. I will put some instructions. One is, watch it on 1.5 speed, follow along and do the steps while it's happening, so you can be kind of half done with the first country report 10 minutes into the video, or something like that. So anyways, I'll put that in the description. But yeah, hopefully this was useful to you. Definitely this will, no excuses if you just grab random data from random places, because this should be a very clear way. And basically, if the data exists in the World Bank site, I want you getting it from here, because all the other places students will grab it from generally will not be as reliable as what is here.